2. Not your business, Corsair warned himself. Keep your head down. However, the face of his daughter flashed through Caleb's mind. This girl was someone's child. The gut-wrenching dread crippled him for a second as his memory sucked him back to the gas station in southern Florida, where he straddled the lifeless figure of his only son, Jackson. Throughout his career, Caleb witnessed more atrocities than most people can imagine, but the seared image of his son who didn't even have time to bleed out, in fact, the boy was dead from a gunshot wound to the head before his body hit the ground, burned its way to the surface at least twice a day. The girl strolling away from the Los Muertos pier wasn't older than 22. A baby compared to Caleb. Her dark brown hair pulled back in a ponytail, with a red ribbon pinching the strands together. Someone's baby, he reminded himself. Fuck, he mumbled, walking toward the restaurant where Felix, a server with whom he'd become friendly, stood. Felix, tengo que irme, Caleb told him. I have to go. Without waiting for a response, Caleb dropped the legs on the table and slid the leather strap off his neck. The towel whipped off his belt and landed on top of the pile of oysters. The oyster knife, however, slipped into the pocket of Corsair's shorts. It was early afternoon, and while historically most of Mexico took this time after lunch to rest, Puerto Vallarta long ago left that tradition behind as it tried to accommodate the thousands of tourists filling its streets every day. If the foreign visitors intended to spend their money during siesta, then the businesses of Puerto Vallarta would make it work. That meant right now visitors crowded the sidewalks, moving either from one bar to the next or from their hotel to the beach. Or vice versa. It didn't matter where they were going, it only seemed important that they went. Whatever the Giants fan intended to do, it was a safe bet it wouldn't happen in a crowd, especially among the Saturday afternoon activities. Although that was not a guarantee. Corsair recalled 3 kills he made amid a thick throng of people. Anything was possible. However, Corsair considered himself an aberration. A flick of the wrist allowed him to drive a blade into a man's jugular without losing a stride. By the time the wound sprayed blood, he'd be 10 to 15 feet away and never look back. As he reasoned this, he remembered each of those 3 hits. He donned a pair of headphones, obvious ones, not earbuds, giving him every appearance of oblivion to everything that happened in his vicinity. In contrast, the football fan spent a lot of energy swiveling his head as he watched the surrounding crowd. Perhaps he was used to New York City, where pedestrians actually noticed others when they were different. It seemed the opposite of what most people would say about New York. They'd call it impersonal. It was easy to get lost in. That was true, but strangely, Americans judged things that didn't fit their mold. Caleb's experience had been that not only did people notice dissimilarities from them, but they didn't like them. Well, at least the outspoken demographic vocalized that. However, in Puerto Vallarta, it was a unique environment. With banners hanging from every light post in the Zona Romantica, GD1, advertising the drag reviews and the heavy population of foreigners, most people seemed to realize that nothing was unusual in PV. Motorcades of heavily armed police forces might roll down Olas Altas, followed by a parade of goats. It might draw a curious eye, but that would be all. Caleb assured himself that this hunter would not act until he isolated the girl from the crowd. If the Giants fan cornered her alone, then Corsair's reactions would draw no attention to himself. As a predator himself, Caleb wondered what the man's reasons for targeting the woman were. A thought like that would never have occurred to him before he met Audrey. He wasn't a psychopath, although he assumed he had some sociopathic tendencies. Probably most professional soldiers did, to some extent. Otherwise, the faces of the dead would render many incapable of further action. To Caleb Saunders, it was duty to country. But his wife brought out more from him. She understood what he was. After the second date, Caleb realized he wanted to be with her, and he didn't want to keep any secret about himself from her. Not if he ever wanted her completely. Thinking about their second date spread a smile across his face. It didn't linger because, like any fond memory of Audrey, the grief of losing her followed with a sucker punch to the stomach. Corsair pushed the sorrow away as he focused on the man 75 feet in front of him. Was he a professional? Or was this some impulse brought on by whatever feature the girl was unlucky enough to possess? He supposed some serial killers had a similar mindset to assassins. A hired hitman killed based on orders without respect to the individual. They were basically decrees, therefore, they were to be obeyed unequivocally. Perhaps a serial killer obeyed those impulses the same way Corsair followed commands, unquestioningly. His attention shifted to the girl who had turned north on Olas Altas, walking toward the Malecon. A brightly colored sundress hung from 2 straps off her shoulder. It was common attire for almost all women he'd seen since arriving in Jalisco. It seemed to fit every daily need, from strolling on the beach to working in a shop. She wore sandals that Audrey would have called cute. It was odd how at one time, he'd only noticed the shoes based on their ability to help his target run from him. Now he recognized the style too. He'd long determined that cute didn't mean practical, something he would warn Audrey about every time she brought home a new pair of shoes. She continued past Basilio Badillo, where vendors set up stands lined up on the north curb, so that the diners at the restaurants across the street stared at carts filled with the same goods someone else sold along the beach all day. Surprisingly, most of the things were made in Mexico, although Caleb doubted they were local. There was probably a factory in Mexico City churning out leather commodities and decorative table coverings that ended up in places like Cancun, Cabo, and Puerto Vallarta. After the following block, she veered into Cardenas Park. The New Yorker picked up the pace as soon as she vanished from his view. He tried to close the distance between them without her noticing him. It was a sloppy execution as he almost sprinted forward through the people. Caleb locked his eyes on the bright blue cap as he zigged around the individuals massing along the sidewalk. Corsair would not run yet. One person dashing down the sidewalk would attract some consideration. 2 people became a chase, and that was worth pulling their phones out to catch what might happen next. The last thing Caleb Saunders wanted was to be the center of someone's Facebook feed. That kind of attention would be pinged by whatever software the CIA and OOC currently used to hunt down assets like Caleb. Nowadays, it was damn near impossible to elude cameras. Facial recognition software had reached its pinnacle, and based on the way technology evolved, it was only going to get more precise. The only defense for someone hiding out like Caleb was to avoid places where the OOC focused their attention. If any excitement occurred, Caleb would cover his face and vanish in the blink of an eye. The first week he was in Puerto Vallarta, he mentally mapped every visible camera within a 6-block radius of his flat. Should he need to make his way home, he had a route to his apartment that never offered a clear image to a single camera. At least in theory, that would work. It was impossible to predict when Becky from Kansas State would snap a selfie on the street ahead of Caleb. At the end of the day, safety measures only protected him so much. Lázaro Cárdenas Park occupied an entire block along the Romantic Zones section of the Malecon, a pedestrian walkway stretching a little over a mile from the Los Muertos Pier north to Calle 31 de Octubre, or, as the visitors noted, the McDonald's. Every Saturday, Cárdenas Park hosted the farmers market GD2, filling with tents and tables offering fresh food, crafts, and artwork. It also brought in scores of shoppers. If the sidewalks on either side of Olas Altas were knotted on a Saturday afternoon, the park resembled a wad of Celtic knots as lines formed for warm tortillas, street tacos, marmalades, and fresh bread. Caleb lost sight of the girl in the crowd, but the blue hat bobbed past an array of strawberries and blueberries. A raised gazebo sat in the center of the park, and Caleb squeezed behind a table where a woman with jars of homemade jellies stacked them in pyramids. "Perdón," he said to her. "Pardon." She glared at him as he climbed the 4 steps to stand for a brief second above the crowd. He located the girl as she turned north on the street just west of Cárdenas Park. Caleb continued through the gazebo and made a beeline to the next road. In less than a minute, he wriggled through the Saturday afternoon throng, but he reached the corner of Lázaro Cárdenas and Pino Suárez streets just as the New Yorker came out of the park. Corsair brushed against him. The Giants fan never felt him pick the knife out of his pocket. Caleb didn't feel a gun, and after he took 10 steps, Caleb spun back to follow him again. He examined the 4-inch blade. The man bought it somewhere in Mexico, likely from a street vendor. It had a small leather sheath designed to attach to a belt at the waist. Obviously, the man didn't want to draw any attention. Most tourists didn't walk around brandishing weapons. The crowds thinned as they moved away from the park. The girl made a right at the next block. She slowed in front of the boutique at the corner. Caleb wondered if it was part of a surveillance detection tactic. The man ahead of him hesitated a step, but Caleb continued at the same pace. He pulled his most recent prepaid phone from his pocket, lifted it to his ear as if he were engaged in a conversation as he passed the Giants fan.